October 25th, 1415. Dawn broke cold and miserable over the muddy fields near Azincourt in northern France. King Henry V of England, 28 years old and desperately sick with dysentery, surveyed his army of perhaps 6,000 men. They were starving, disease-ridden and exhausted from a grueling march across hostile territory. Many could barely stand. Some were barefoot, their boots long since rotted away in the constant rain. They faced a French army that outnumbered them by at least 3 to 1, possibly 5 to 1. Fresh, well-fed, magnificently armoured knights mounted on the finest warhorses in Christendom. The cream of French nobility, men who had trained for war since childhood, who saw combat as their birthright and honour as more precious than life itself. The French were so confident of victory that they had spent the previous night gambling over who would capture the English king. Ransoms were already being negotiated for nobles who hadn't yet been taken prisoner. Some French knights were arguing about who had the right to take Henry alive, what his ransom should be, how they would divide the spoils. Laughter and music drifted across the fields from the French camp. They were celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet, mocking the pathetic English rabble that dared to march through France. What the French nobility failed to understand, what their culture of chivalric warfare had blinded them to, was that Henry's starving army possessed a weapon that would render their magnificence irrelevant. A simple wooden bow, 6 feet of yew and hemp string, that could be made by any village craftsman. In the hands of trained English and Welsh archers, this peasant's tool would become the most devastating weapon system on the medieval battlefield. Within hours, the flower of French chivalry would be drowning in their own blood, their invincible armour turned into death traps, their magnificent warhorses transformed into screaming instruments of chaos. This is the story of how industrial-scale violence defeated individual prowess, how English yeomen slaughtered French nobility, and how the military aristocracy of medieval Europe learned that technology and training could trump breeding and tradition. The Battle of Agincourt would haunt French nightmares for generations. But to understand the horror that unfolded in those muddy fields, we need to understand the weapon that made it possible. The English longbow was not a sophisticated piece of technology. It was a length of yew wood, preferably cut from trees grown on the border between Italy and Spain, where the climate produced the perfect combination of springy sapwood and dense heartwood. The stave was shaped so that the sapwood faced the target, providing elasticity under tension, while the heartwood on the inside resisted compression. The entire bow was roughly cylindrical, thick in the middle and tapering toward the tips. A hemp string connected the ends. That was it. No moving parts, no complex mechanisms, nothing that couldn't be understood at a glance. But this simplicity was deceptive. An English warbow drew between 130 and 180 pounds, requiring tremendous strength to pull to full draw. Modern compound bows used for hunting typically max out at 70 pounds. Olympic recurve bows draw around 50 pounds. The English longbow required roughly 3 times that force, sustained through the entire shooting sequence. Drawing such a bow was not a matter of arm strength alone. It required engaging the entire body, the back, shoulders, core and legs, pulling with muscles that had been trained from childhood. English law from the 13th century onward required regular archery practice for all able-bodied men. Boys began training as young as 7 years old, starting with lighter bows and gradually building strength. By the time they reached fighting age, English archers had been shooting for 15 years or more. Their skeletons showed the effects. Archaeologists examining remains of medieval archers found distinctive deformities in the left arm bones and shoulder, the result of decades of asymmetric stress. The left arms were visibly thicker than the right, with enlarged attachments where muscles connected to bone. These were bodies literally reshaped by their weapon. The arrows were equally important. A war arrow was not the delicate sporting shaft used for hunting game. It was 30 inches of ash or poplar tipped with a steel bodkin point designed for a single purpose, penetrating armour. The bodkin was a narrow needle-like point, sometimes square in cross-section, sometimes triangular or diamond-shaped. Unlike broad hunting heads meant to cause bleeding, bodkins were designed to punch through the gaps in armour, through chainmail links, through the vulnerable points at joints and visor slits. They were armour-piercing rounds 700 years before the term existed. A skilled archer could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute in sustained fire, up to 20 in short bursts. This rate of fire was unmatched by any other weapon system of the period. Crossbows, while powerful, could manage perhaps 2 shots per minute. Handguns, still primitive in the early 15th century, were even slower. But a formation of longbowmen could create a sustained storm of projectiles that resembled modern artillery more than individual aimed shots. The English had learned the longbow's effectiveness the hard way, by being on the receiving end. Welsh archers had bloodied English armies for centuries. When Edward I finally conquered Wales in the late 13th century, he was wise enough to incorporate Welsh bowmen into his own forces. By the 14th century, the longbow had become the foundation of English military doctrine. While other European powers relied on mounted knights and crossbowmen, England built its armies around massed archery. The tactical implications were revolutionary. Traditional medieval warfare was dominated by heavy cavalry, armoured knights who were essentially human tanks, expensive, highly trained, devastating in the charge. Infantry existed primarily to support the knights, or to be ridden down by enemy knights. Battles were decided by cavalry charges, by individual prowess, by the shock of armoured horsemen smashing into enemy formations. This was warfare as sport, governed by rules of chivalry, where nobles fought other nobles for honour and ransom. English archery demolished this entire system. A peasant with a bow, a man who might be worth a few shillings in ransom, could kill a fully armoured knight worth hundreds or thousands of pounds. The arrows didn't care about lineage or training or codes of honour. They simply punched through whatever they hit, turning the military aristocracy into targets. The French had experienced this horror before, at Crécy in 1346 and at Poitiers in 1356. At both battles, outnumbered English armies had massacred French nobility with massed archery. Yet the lessons hadn't penetrated French military culture. Knights still believed in the supremacy of heavy cavalry. Archery was dismissed as a peasant's weapon, beneath the dignity of true warriors. By October 1415, Henry V was desperately trying to get his army back to English-held Calais. What should have been a quick march had turned into a nightmare. French forces had destroyed bridges, forcing lengthy detours. Torrential rains had turned roads into swamps. Dysentery ravaged the English ranks. Men were dying not from combat, but from disease and exhaustion. The French army, commanded by Constable Charles d'Albret, had manoeuvred to block Henry's path near the village of Azincourt. Henry's position was nearly hopeless. His army was trapped between the French force and the Somme River. Retreat was impossible. Surrender would mean crushing ransoms that would bankrupt England. The only option was to fight through, to somehow defeat a French army that outnumbered him by at least 3-1. Modern estimates put French numbers at around 12,000 men, though medieval chronicles claimed numbers as high as 30,000. Even the conservative estimate meant Henry faced terrible odds. The battlefield itself seemed designed to favour the French. It was a narrow corridor between 2 woods, perhaps 900 to 1,200 yards wide. This funneled the massive French army into a compressed space that negated their numerical advantage. But it also meant there was no room for the English to manoeuvre, no way to avoid the French charge. The recent rains had turned the freshly ploughed fields into a quagmire. The heavy clay soil of northern France became glutinous mud that would suck at boots and hooves, exhausting anyone trying to move through it. Henry deployed his forces in the standard English formation developed over decades of longbow warfare. The archers formed the bulk of the army, perhaps 5,000 men arranged in a shallow wedge or harrow formation. They were positioned on the flanks and in the centre, creating overlapping fields of fire. The dismounted men-at-arms, the knights and nobles, formed a relatively thin line in the centre, maybe 900 to 1,000 men deep. This was the reverse of traditional deployment where knights were the main force and infantry the support. In Henry's army, the archers were the killing arm and the knights were there primarily to hold ground and protect the bowmen. Each archer carried a sheaf of 24 arrows. Some sources suggest they had 2 sheaves, 48 arrows total. With 5,000 archers, this meant potentially 240,000 arrows available, though the realistic number was probably lower given losses and damaged equipment during the march. Still, it represented an enormous amount of firepower. The archers also carried wooden stakes sharpened at both ends, which they hammered into the ground at an angle pointing toward the enemy. These stakes created a defensive barrier against cavalry charges, a medieval version of anti-tank obstacles. The French deployment was everything Henry could have hoped for in his desperate situation. Rather than using their numerical superiority to envelop the English position, or waiting for the starving English to attack into their prepared positions, the French crowded into a dense formation in the narrow field. They organised into 3 battles or divisions. The vanguard, 8,000 men at arms dismounted because French commanders had learned at Crécy that horses were vulnerable to arrows. Behind them, a second battle of similar size, also on foot. Behind that, mounted knights held in reserve, perhaps 2,000 cavalry. On the flanks, 2 wings of mounted knights, 500 to 800 horsemen each, tasked with riding down the English archers before they could do damage. This deployment contained a fatal assumption that armoured men on foot could advance through arrow fire and close with the English men at arms, that the archers could be neutralised by the flank cavalry charges, that French armour was sufficient protection. French plate armour of the early 15th century was indeed impressive, the finest personal protection available. A fully armoured knight wore 50 to 60 pounds of steel, helmet, breastplate, backplate, arm and leg protection, gauntlets, all articulated to allow movement. This armour could turn aside sword cuts, deflect lance thrusts, stop crossbow bolts at distance. It represented years of a master armourer's work and cost more than a village might produce in a year. What the French failed to appreciate was that English archers weren't shooting at distance. At Agincourt, the narrow field and English defensive position meant that effective range was reduced. The archers would be shooting at close range, perhaps 50 to 100 yards, where their heavy bows could drive bodkin points through armour plate not consistently but often enough. More importantly, they would be shooting in volley fire, hundreds or thousands of arrows converging on densely packed formations. Even if only a small percentage penetrated armour, the sheer volume of fire guaranteed casualties. The battle began around 11 in the morning on October 25th, after hours of both armies staring at each other across the muddy field. Henry was in an impossible position. He couldn't wait, his army was starving and would only grow weaker. He couldn't retreat. The French blocked his path. His only option was to somehow provoke the French into attacking across the muddy field. He ordered his army forward, advancing to within the extreme bowshot of the French line, perhaps 300 yards. The archers pulled up their stakes, carried them forward, and hammered them in again. Then they began shooting. The first volleys arced high into the grey October sky, thousands of arrows rising like a dark cloud before plunging down onto the French formations. The sound was distinctive, a whistling rushing noise like wind through trees, but deeper, more menacing. Then the arrows arrived, impacting with sounds like hail on a roof, metallic clattering as bodkin points struck armour plate, mixed with softer thuds where they found flesh, and the screaming, always the screaming. Men struck in gaps in armour, in vulnerable points at joints, in faces where visors were raised, in hands and arms and legs where protection was lighter. Arrows punching through mail, through padded gambesons, into bodies. Not every arrow killed, not every arrow even wounded seriously, but with thousands of arrows falling every minute, the casualties mounted instantly. More psychologically devastating was the effect on morale. Standing in formation while death rained from the sky, unable to retaliate, unable to see where the next arrow would fall, watching comrades fall around you, it was torture. The French cavalry on the flanks charged immediately exactly as planned. 500 mounted knights thundered toward the English archers, lowering lances, intending to ride down the peasant bowmen and clear the way for the infantry assault. It should have worked. Cavalry charges were supposed to scatter infantry. The psychological impact of tons of horseflesh and steel bearing down was supposed to break men's nerve. But the English archers didn't break. They had faced cavalry charges before. They had trained for exactly this moment. They knew their stakes and their bows were their protection. The archers shifted fire from the French infantry to the charging cavalry, now shooting at close range, perhaps 50 yards or less, where their heavy bows achieved maximum penetration. Horses, lacking armour, were desperately vulnerable. Arrows slammed into charging destriers, into chests and necks and faces. A warhorse hit by a bodkin point travelling at nearly 200 feet per second experienced catastrophic trauma. The arrows punched completely through the animals, organs ruptured, bones shattered. Horses went down instantly, their legs cut from under them, their riders thrown. The survivors of the first arrow impacts reached the stakes and discovered another horror. The sharpened wooden posts gutted horses that impaled themselves, creating a barrier of dying animals and trapped knights. Horses reared and wheeled, trying to escape, crashing into horses behind them. the charge disintegrated into chaos. Wounded animals screaming and thrashing, knights thrown from saddles landing in mud, unable to rise in their heavy armour, more arrows sleeting down continuously. Those cavalry who made it past the stakes found the archers had drawn swords, axes and hammers. Medieval English archers weren't just bowmen, they were soldiers, often veterans, comfortable with close combat. They swarmed unhorsed knights, stabbing at joints in armour, flipping men onto their backs where they were helpless, smashing helmets with mallets. The cavalry charges that were supposed to clear the flanks instead resulted in hundreds of French nobles dead or captured in the first minutes of battle. The failure of the cavalry charges should have been a warning, but the French vanguard was already committed. 8,000 dismounted men-at-arms slogging forward through the muddy field. These were not common soldiers, they were the nobility of France, men wearing personal armour that cost more than castles, carrying weapons passed down through generations, trained for warfare from childhood. They advanced in dense formation, shoulder to shoulder, their armour reducing them to walking slowly in the thick mud. The English archers resumed shooting into the advancing mass. At this range, perhaps 100 to 200 yards initially, closing steadily, the bows achieved maximum effect. Arrows fell in continuous sheets, thousands upon thousands of steel-tipped shafts arcing into the compressed French formation. The narrow field forced the French into even tighter density, as men from the sides compressed toward the centre, trying to avoid the killing zones on the flanks where archer fire was most concentrated. The arrow storm was unlike anything in modern experience. Imagine standing in a packed crowd while machine gun fire rakes across it, but slower, more personal, each impact visible, each scream identifiable. Men fell continuously, not just from direct hits but from falling over bodies, from slipping in mud, from exhaustion in their heavy armour. The French formation began to slow, then stagger, men in front trying to push forward, men behind pushing them, everyone sinking into mud that was increasingly mixed with blood. Arrows that missed men stuck in the ground, creating a forest of shafts that made movement even more difficult. Some French knights had dozens of arrows lodged in their armour, not penetrating but adding weight, catching on equipment, restricting movement. Face protection was particularly vulnerable. Visors had to have slits for vision, and bodkin points could penetrate these slits. Multiple French nobles were killed by arrows through the face, the bodkin punching through the eye socket into the brain. The advance that should have taken perhaps 5 minutes stretched to 10, then 15. Men were exhausted before they even reached the English line, gasping for air inside their helmets, dehydrated, muscles screaming from the effort of moving in heavy armour through sucking mud. All while arrows continued to fall. The psychological effect was devastating, knowing that the next step could be your last, hearing men around you dying, unable to see through your narrow visor slits, unable to breathe properly, unable to do anything but push forward toward the thin English line. When the French vanguard finally reached the English men-at-arms, they no longer had the energy for effective combat. The collision was not the thunderous crash of fresh troops, but more like exhausted men falling against each other. The English line rested and positioned on slightly higher ground with better footing held. More critically, the English were not alone. As the French engaged the centre, English archers on both flanks dropped their bows and attacked the French from the sides with swords, axes, mallets, and daggers. Medieval armour was designed primarily to protect against strikes from the front, against sword cuts and lance thrusts. It was less effective against attacks from the sides and rear, against weapons specifically designed to defeat armour. The archers carried hammers and poleaxes meant to crush armour, daggers designed to thrust into joints. They swarmed the French flanks, attacking men who were already exhausted, already wounded, already demoralised. The French second battle, seeing the vanguard engaged, pushed forward to support them, adding another 8,000 men into the confined killing ground. But rather than reinforcing the attack, they created a catastrophe. The narrow field couldn't accommodate such numbers. Men were packed so tightly they couldn't swing their weapons. The pressure from behind pushed front ranks into the English line where they couldn't fight effectively. Men fell and couldn't rise, suffocating under the weight of bodies. The mud had become a slurry of blood and filth, where men drowned face down, unable to rise in their armour. The English archers continued their grim work, shooting into the packed French formation at point-blank range, then wading in with hand weapons when targets were too close. The French were trapped, unable to advance effectively, unable to retreat through the press of men behind them, unable to fight effectively in the crush. What should have been a battle became a slaughter. French sources describe knights trapped upright in the press, unable to fall even when dead, held in place by the density of bodies around them, men crying for mercy, offering enormous ransoms, being cut down anyway because there was no time to take prisoners while the battle continued. The Englishmen at arms and archers killing with industrial efficiency, no chivalry, no honour, just methodical butchery of helpless enemies. The only significant threat came from the mounted reserve, roughly 2,000 cavalry who could potentially have flanked the English position or broken through the exhausted English line. But seeing the disaster unfolding in front of them, seeing the cream of French nobility dying in the mud, the cavalry commanders lost their nerve and withdrew without charging. Their departure sealed French defeat. The slaughter continued for perhaps 3 hours. By early afternoon, the muddy field between the woods was carpeted with French dead and dying. Modern estimates suggest 6,000 to 10,000 French casualties, the vast majority fatal. The French nobility was devastated. 3 dukes dead, 5 counts dead, over 100 barons and knights dead. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, dead. The Constable's deputy dead. The Admiral of France dead. It was a generational catastrophe for French aristocracy. English losses were astonishingly light, perhaps 100 to 400 men total, most of them from the initial cavalry charges and the fighting when the French vanguard reached the English line. The archers, who had done the bulk of the killing, suffered minimal casualties because the French had never reached them in strength. The disparity was so extreme that chroniclers struggled to believe it. Some claimed divine intervention, others attributed it to French incompetence. None wanted to admit that peasant archers had massacred noble knights. The most controversial moment came in the afternoon when Henry, fearing a French counterattack from regrouped cavalry and worried about French prisoners outnumbering his guards, ordered the prisoners executed. This violated every principle of chivalric warfare where nobles were captured for ransom, not killed. But Henry was desperate, outnumbered, deep in enemy territory. He couldn't guard thousands of prisoners and fight another battle. The order was given and the prisoners were killed, probably not all of them but many, adding to the day's horror. The French cavalry never attacked. They withdrew, leaving thousands of French wounded dying in the mud. When English soldiers moved through the field that evening stripping bodies of armour and valuables, they found French nobles drowning in mud puddles, suffocated under bodies, dead from exhaustion and dehydration as much as from wounds. Some had died without a mark on them, simply expired from the exertion of moving in heavy armour through mud while wearing dozens of arrow shafts lodged in their armour. The Battle of Agincourt shattered French military power for a generation. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical casualties. The invincible French knight, the pinnacle of medieval warfare, had been revealed as helpless against massed archery and favourable terrain. Nobility, training, and expensive equipment meant nothing against volume of fire and tactical positioning. For England, Agincourt became a foundational myth, proof that English yeomen were superior to French nobles, that native English virtue could overcome foreign numbers. This was nonsense, of course. The battle was won by superior weapons technology, training, tactics, and favourable terrain, not by inherent English superiority. But the myth persisted, shaping English self-identity for centuries. For France, Agincourt was trauma. An entire generation of nobility wiped out in an afternoon. The implications were staggering. If noble cavalry could be defeated by peasant archers, what was the point of nobility? If birth and breeding couldn't ensure victory, what justified aristocratic privilege? These were dangerous questions that undermined the entire feudal system. The Longbows' dominance would continue for another century before gunpowder weapons finally supplanted it. At Flodden in 1513, English archers would slaughter Scottish nobility just as thoroughly as they had French at Agincourt. But the Longbow's weakness was already apparent. It required years of training to use effectively, training that had to start in childhood. You couldn't quickly train longbowmen, you had to grow them from boyhood. This made the weapon system impossible to expand rapidly, or to transfer to other nations. Gunpowder weapons, while less effective initially, could be learned in weeks rather than years. any peasant could be taught to shoot a musket in the time it took to train a single longbowman. As firearms improved, they matched and eventually exceeded bow performance without requiring the lengthy training. By the mid-16th century, the longbow was obsolete except for hunting and sport. But on that muddy October day in 1415, the longbow was supreme, and English archers rewrote the rules of warfare. They proved that volume of fire could defeat armour and nobility, that peasant soldiers with proper equipment and training could massacre knightly elites, that technology and tactics mattered more than individual prowess and breeding. The French knights had charged laughing that morning, confident in their numerical superiority, their magnificent armour, their noble lineage. They believed they were facing a demoralised rabble that would break at the first charge. What they encountered instead was a killing system optimised over decades of warfare. 5,000 bowmen who could each loose 10 arrows per minute, creating a storm of steel that turned the narrow field into an abattoir. The laughter died in the first minutes when cavalry charges disintegrated under arrow fire, when horses impaled themselves on stakes, when knights realised their armour was not the invulnerable protection they had believed. It died further when the dismounted vanguard discovered that advancing through mud under continuous arrow fire was exhausting beyond anything they had experienced. It died completely when they reached the English line too tired to fight effectively, and discovered English archers attacking their flanks with hammers and axes. By afternoon there was no more laughter, only screaming and dying, thousands of France's nobility drowning in mud, suffocating under bodies, bleeding out from wounds, dying of exhaustion in their expensive armour. The field was red with blood mixed into mud, bodies stacked so thickly that horses couldn't walk through them. The English archers, many of them common farmers and craftsmen, stood exhausted among piles of dead nobles, their simple yew-bows having destroyed the flower of French chivalry. King Henry had won an impossible victory, but it was the longbow that had delivered it, 6 feet of wood and string wielded by trained hands, creating industrial-scale violence that medieval armour and chivalric tradition had no answer for. The weapon that French knights had dismissed as beneath their dignity had buried them beneath the mud of Agincourt. The battle's lessons echoed across Europe. Armour alone was insufficient. Numerical superiority could be negated by terrain and firepower. Peasant soldiers with effective weapons could defeat noble cavalry. Tactical positioning mattered more than individual prowess. These lessons would reshape European warfare, accelerating the transition from feudal levies to professional armies, from individual combat to unit tactics, from cavalry dominance to combined arms warfare. But in October 1415, these implications were not yet clear. What was clear was that English archers had accomplished something that seemed impossible. They had shattered a French army 3 times their size, killed thousands of French nobles while suffering minimal casualties, and secured Henry's escape to Calais. They had done it with a peasant's weapon, a simple wooden bow, proving that in warfare effectiveness mattered more than elegance and results mattered more than pedigree. The survivors on both sides would carry Agincourt's memory forever, the English with pride, the French with shame and trauma. French knights had learned that their magnificent armour could be penetrated, their warhorses could be killed, their numerical superiority could be negated, their noble lineage could not protect them from bodkin points launched by common archers. The psychological wound never fully healed. English archers had learned that with proper deployment and favourable terrain, they could defeat any enemy regardless of armour or numbers, that their years of training from childhood had purpose, that their weapon was truly supreme. This knowledge shaped English military doctrine for generations. The longbow remained England's primary weapon system, long after other nations had abandoned it for firearms. The muddy field at Azincourt, where French nobility, drowned in blood and mud, became a pilgrimage site for English soldiers, a reminder that skill and discipline could overcome apparent impossibility, that the right weapon in trained hands could defeat any enemy. The longbow, dismissed by continental aristocrats as a peasant's tool, had demonstrated its devastating effectiveness in the most unambiguous way possible. October the 25th, 1415, proved that warfare was changing, that technology and tactics were beginning to matter more than individual prowess, that mass was beginning to trump elite quality, that the age of chivalric single combat was giving way to industrial violence. The longbow was not yet a firearm, not yet mechanized warfare, but it was a step in that direction, a weapon system that created volume of fire sufficient to overwhelm traditional defences. French knights had charged laughing that morning and died screaming that afternoon, victims of a weapon system they had underestimated, a tactical deployment they had failed to counter, terrain that favoured their enemy, and English commanders who understood that modern warfare required more than courage and bloodline. The field turned red not with glory but with blood. Aristocratic blood mixed indiscriminately with common blood in mud that cared nothing for nobility. The English longbows' supremacy would not last forever, but on that October day it was absolute, and the French nobility paid the price in thousands of lives, careers and dreams ended by pointed sticks launched from peasant bows. The laughter had turned to screaming, the confidence to terror, the charge to rout, and the field to red. Agincourt stands as perhaps the ultimate demonstration of the longbow's lethal effectiveness, and as a watershed moment when medieval warfare began its transition toward modernity. The aftermath of Agincourt reverberated through Europe with an intensity that shocked even those who understood the battle's significance. When news reached Paris 3 days later, the French court initially refused to believe the reports. The numbers seemed impossible, fabricated by English propagandists. 6,000 to 10,000 French dead against perhaps 200 English casualties. 3 dukes, 5 counts, 90 barons killed. The Constable of France dead. It had to be exaggeration. But as survivors straggled back and the lists of the dead grew longer, the horrifying truth became undeniable. The social impact on France was catastrophic beyond the immediate military defeat. Entire noble families were wiped out in a single afternoon. The Duke of Brabant, the Duke of Alençon, the Duke of Bar, all dead in the mud. The Count of Nevers, the Count of Vaucourt, the Count of Marle dead. At least 120 noble families lost their heads of household at Agincourt. The knock-on effects rippled through French society for decades. Estates fell into the hands of minors or distant relatives. Marriage alliances collapsed. Political factions lost their leaders. The carefully constructed web of feudal obligations and relationships that held French society together was shredded. Financially, the disaster was equally severe. Each dead noble represented not just a military loss, but an economic catastrophe for their dependents. The armour alone, 50 to 60 pounds of custom-fitted plate steel, represented years of an armourer's work and extraordinary expense. At Agincourt, thousands of complete armour harnesses were lost, either captured by the English or ruined beyond repair, buried in mud with their owners. The economic value of the equipment lost exceeded the annual revenue of many French provinces. The horses, specially bred and trained warhorses worth small fortunes, were slaughtered by the hundreds. Each destrier represented years of breeding programs and training, investments that could never be recovered. The captured nobles faced a different nightmare. Those who survived to be taken prisoner discovered that Henry, having violated chivalric custom by executing many prisoners during the battle, was now determined to extract maximum ransoms from those who remained. The going rate for a noble prisoner was typically 1 year's income from their estates, but Henry demanded far more, often 2 or 3 years' revenue. Families were bankrupted trying to raise ransoms. Estates were mortgaged. Some prisoners remained in English captivity for years, their families unable to raise the demanded sums. Charles, Duke of Orléans, captured at Agincourt at age 21, would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England. A quarter-century of his life taken because he survived where others died. His ransom was finally paid in 1440, an astronomical sum that beggared his duchy. His case was extreme but not unique. Dozens of French nobles spent 5, 10, 15 years in captivity, their productive lives wasted, their families impoverished, all because English archers had been too effective at their work. The psychological trauma extended beyond the nobility to French society as a whole. The myth of knightly invincibility, the foundation of feudal social hierarchy, had been shattered. If a properly armoured knight on horseback could be killed by a common archer, if nobility and training meant nothing against volume of fire, then what justified the enormous social and economic privileges of the aristocracy? These were dangerous questions that undermined the entire social order. The Church tried to frame Agincourt as divine punishment for French sins, suggesting that God had allowed the defeat to chasten French pride. This helped maintain social stability, but didn't answer the practical question of how to defeat English archery. French military theorists struggled with this problem for years, Some argued for better armour, thicker plate, improved face protection. But armour was already approaching the practical limits of weight and mobility. A knight in full harness was barely mobile on foot. Any additional weight would make movement impossible. Others suggested avoiding battle entirely, using siege warfare and attrition instead of field battles. This was strategically sound but psychologically difficult for a martial culture built around concepts of honour and glorious combat. A few French commanders understood the real lesson of Agincourt, that the English tactical system combining archers with dismounted men-at-arms and favourable terrain was nearly unbeatable in certain circumstances, but could be defeated if the French refused to attack on English terms. Avoid narrow fields, avoid frontal assaults, use superior numbers to envelop English positions, attack their supply lines, force them to advance rather than defend. These were the tactics that would eventually win the 100 Years' War for France, but they required patience and a willingness to avoid glorious battle, qualities in short supply among French nobility in 1415. For England, Agincourt became instant legend. Henry returned home to triumphant celebration, parades through London, religious services giving thanks to God for miraculous victory. The battle was framed as proof of divine favour, evidence that God supported English claims to the French throne, validation of Henry's invasion. The longbow and the archers who wielded it became national symbols. Parliament granted funds for the continuation of the war. English nobles, seeing French estates as plunder waiting to be taken, enthusiastically supported further campaigns. The archers themselves received modest rewards by modern standards. Many were granted small parcels of captured French land. Some received cash bonuses, a few pounds each, significant money for common soldiers but hardly life-changing wealth. The real reward was social status. English archers, previously regarded as simple yeomen, became celebrated figures. Ballads were written about their exploits. Their weapon became a symbol of English military superiority and national identity. But beneath the celebration lay a disturbing reality that English commanders understood even if the public did not. Agincourt had been won as much by French mistakes and favourable circumstances as by English superiority. The narrow field, the mud, the inexplicable French decision to attack on English terms rather than waiting for the starving English to surrender or attack prepared positions, all of these factors had been necessary for English victory. Against a competent French commander on open terrain in dry conditions, the battle might have ended very differently. Moreover, the English tactical system had inherent limitations. Longbowmen required years of training starting in childhood. England's population was small compared to France, perhaps 3 million versus 15 million. Even with mandatory archery practice, England could field perhaps 10 to 15,000 trained longbowmen maximum. This was insufficient for conquering and holding France. Every battle risked veteran archers who could not be quickly replaced. A few defeats could destroy the archer corps that English military power depended upon. Henry understood these limitations. His strategy after Agincourt focused on sieges and occupation rather than seeking further field battles. Between 1417 and 1420, English forces systematically captured Norman fortresses, consolidating control over northern France. This was brutal, grinding warfare, sieges lasting months, limited opportunities for the dramatic archery victories that had characterized Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. English archers found themselves doing garrison duty, dying of disease and malnutrition in besieged castles, fighting skirmishes rather than set-piece battles. The nature of longbow warfare changed during these years. In field battles, archers operated in large formations, creating volume of fire. In sieges and skirmishes, they worked in smaller groups, using precision shooting to suppress enemy archers and crossbowmen, to hit targets on walls, to support escalades and assaults. This required different skills, patience and accuracy rather than rapid shooting, understanding of trajectories and windage, ability to shoot from cover. The siege archers became specialists, less celebrated than their battlefield counterparts, but equally essential. The French were learning too. They avoided field battles where English archers had advantage. They improved their crossbowmen using pavises, large shields that crossbowmen could hide behind while reloading. They developed better artillery, bombards and cannon that could destroy English positions from ranges beyond bowshot. They recognized that longbows, for all their effectiveness, had weaknesses that could be exploited. Most significantly, bows were affected by weather. Rain softened bowstrings, reducing power and accuracy. Wet weather made arrows less aerodynamic. English archers stored their bowstrings inside their helmets or clothing to keep them dry, but prolonged rain made effective archery nearly impossible. At the Battle of Patay in 1429, French cavalry caught English archers deployed but not yet properly dug in before their defensive stakes were positioned. Without prepared defences, the archers were vulnerable. French cavalry under Joan of Arc's command charged before the English could establish their defensive formation. The result was catastrophic for the English: 2,000 casualties, including many veteran archers, prisoners, and routed survivors. It was England's worst defeat of the war and proved that English tactics were not invincible. Patay demonstrated what Agincourt had shown in reverse, that tactical positioning and circumstances mattered more than an inherent weapon superiority. English longbowmen in prepared positions with stakes and favourable terrain were nearly unbeatable. The same archers caught unprepared on open ground were vulnerable to cavalry charges. The weapon system required proper deployment to function effectively. This was both a strength and a weakness. Strength because properly deployed English armies were formidable. Weakness because they required specific conditions and could be avoided or countered by cautious opponents. The development of gunpowder weapons accelerated during the decades following Agincourt. Early firearms were primitive, inaccurate, slow to reload, prone to malfunction. But they had advantages that bows lacked. A gunshot was louder and more frightening than an arrow. Firearms could penetrate any armour at close range. Most importantly, firearms required minimal training. A man could learn basic firearms use in a few weeks, versus the years or decades required to master the longbow. As firearms improved through the 15th century, they gradually replaced bows in European armies. England resisted this transition longer than other nations, clinging to the longbow that had brought such glory. As late as 1513 at the Battle of Flodden, English archers massacred Scottish nobility using the same tactics that had worked at Agincourt. 10,000 Scots died, including King James IV, while English casualties were minimal. The narrow ridge where the battle was fought, the prepared English positions, the Scottish decision to attack on English terms, all echoed Agincourt. English commanders drew the obvious conclusion that traditional tactics still worked. But Flodden was the longbow's last hurrah. By the mid-16th century, firearms had improved to the point where they matched bow performance in most situations. Matchlock arquebuses could shoot accurately to 100 yards, farther than most combat archery. They penetrated armour more reliably than arrows. They required far less training. Perhaps most significantly for military commanders, firearms could be mass-produced while bows required skilled craftsmen and archers required years of training. The final death of military archery in England came not from battlefield obsolescence but from social change. The mandatory archery practice that had sustained the longbow tradition declined as England urbanised and industrialised. Young men moved from villages where archery was tradition to cities where it was irrelevant. The village commons where archery was practised were enclosed for agriculture. The wars that had required mass archery ended. By 1600, few Englishmen could draw a warbow, and military archery was extinct except for a few ceremonial units. The longbow's eclipse erased a weapon system that had dominated warfare for over 2 centuries. At its peak, the English longbow was the most effective infantry weapon in the world, capable of defeating the best armoured cavalry in existence, delivering volume of fire that would not be matched until repeating firearms in the 19th century. The 6-foot yew bow wielded by a trained archer represented the pinnacle of pre-gunpowder weapons technology, but it was a technological dead end. The training required made it impossible to expand quickly or transfer to other nations. French attempts to create their own longbow corps failed because they lacked the decades of archery tradition necessary to produce skilled bowmen. Scotland tried and failed for the same reason. The longbow was specifically an English and Welsh weapon, dependent on cultural factors that could not be replicated elsewhere. This made it fundamentally different from firearms, which could be adopted by any nation with industrial capacity to manufacture them. A musket worked the same whether wielded by an Englishman, a Frenchman, or a Spaniard. Training was minimal and universal. This universality meant that firearms scaled in ways bows never could. Armies could be expanded rapidly by simply manufacturing more weapons and providing basic training. The strategic flexibility firearms offered ultimately outweighed any tactical advantages Bulls retained. Yet the memory of Agincourt lingered. For centuries afterward, English writers returned to that muddy October day, when English archers had destroyed French chivalry, when common yeomen had killed armoured nobles, when seemingly impossible odds had been overcome through superior weapons and tactics. The battle became foundational to English national identity, proof of English martial superiority, evidence of English virtue triumphing over foreign numbers. This mythology obscured the reality that Agincourt's outcome depended on specific circumstances unlikely to be repeated. The narrow field that negated French numerical superiority, the mud that exhausted French knights before they reached combat. The French decision to attack prepared English positions rather than using their advantages in numbers and supplies. The failure of French cavalry to coordinate with infantry. The absence of effective French archery or artillery. Remove any of these factors, and the battle likely ends differently. Modern military historians studying Agincourt recognise it as an example of everything going right for one side and everything going wrong for the other, rather than the inevitable English superiority. The French mistakes were as important as English tactics. The terrain and weather were as decisive as the longbow. Henry's leadership and his soldiers' discipline mattered as much as their weapons. It was a confluence of factors producing a decisive result, not simply weapon superiority. Nevertheless, the longbow's effectiveness at Agincourt was undeniable. 5,000 archers created casualty rates that would not be seen again until modern artillery and machine guns. The volume of fire they sustained, 10 to 12 arrows per minute per man, meant 50 to 60,000 arrows per minute across the formation, a storm of projectiles that no medieval armour could fully protect against. The bodkin points, specifically designed to penetrate armour, proved effective enough that even the best protected French knights were vulnerable. The psychological impact of sustained archery was as important as the physical casualties. Standing in formation while arrows fell continuously, watching comrades die, unable to retaliate effectively, exhausting mentally and physically even before close combat began. This psychological warfare degraded French effectiveness before the lines even met. By the time French men-at-arms reached English positions, many were already defeated mentally, their will to fight eroded by the arrow storm they had endured. The English archers' willingness to engage in close combat once French forces closed distinguished them from crossbowmen who typically withdrew behind infantry once enemies approached. English archers carried swords, axes and mallets specifically for close combat. They were trained to fight hand-to-hand, targeting armour joints and weak points. This dual-role capability, both ranged firepower and close combat effectiveness, made them uniquely versatile infantry. Modern military terminology might classify them as light infantry, with heavy fire support capability, filling multiple roles that medieval armies typically required separate troop types for. The logistical requirements for sustaining longbow warfare were enormous and often overlooked. Each archer required a constant supply of arrows, typically carrying 2 sheaves of 24 arrows each into battle but needing replacement arrows after any significant engagement. Arrow production required skilled fletchers, woodworkers who shaped the shafts, blacksmiths who forged the bodkin points, specialists who attached flights and nocks. A major campaign consumed hundreds of thousands of arrows requiring industrial-scale production. The bows themselves required maintenance and replacement. Bowstrings broke regularly, needing immediate replacement. Bow staves cracked or broke under the stress of repeated use, particularly in wet conditions. Each archer needed spare strings and often spare bows. The logistical trains supporting an English army included wagons of spare bows, bundles of bowstrings, barrels of arrows, all requiring transport and protection. Losing this equipment to a raid or ambush could cripple an army's effectiveness as surely as losing the archers themselves. The social impact of military archery on England was profound. The requirement for universal archery training created a population of men comfortable with weapons and organised violence. This had implications beyond military effectiveness. English villages contained hundreds of men trained in the use of weapons that could kill at range, men who had practised regularly since childhood. This armed population shaped English social and political development in ways that distinguished it from continental societies, where weapons training was restricted to aristocracy. The yeoman archer became an idealised figure in English culture, representing the free English farmer, independent, skilled, essential to national defence. This idealisation obscured the reality that archers were often poor, that their service was compulsory, that they died of disease and hunger as often as in battle. But the myth of the yeoman archer as the backbone of England persisted, shaping English self-perception for centuries. Agincourt's place in this mythology was central. The battle where English archers had slaughtered French nobility became the ultimate proof of yeoman superiority, evidence that English common soldiers were better than foreign aristocrats, validation of English social structure. The fact that this interpretation was historically dubious mattered less than its cultural power. Agincourt became a symbol, a reference point, a story told and retold to reinforce English identity. For France, Agincourt remained trauma, the battle where French nobility drowned in mud and blood, where knights were killed by peasant arrows, where everything went catastrophically wrong. French historians struggled to explain the defeat without undermining their own military tradition. Some blamed treachery, claiming French commanders had deliberately led their forces into disaster. Others blamed divine judgment, suggesting God had allowed defeat to punish French sins. Few were willing to admit the simpler explanation that French tactics had been unsuited to circumstances and English tactics had been superior. The French eventually developed effective counters to English archery through hard experience and many defeats. Avoiding battle on English terms, using artillery and crossbows to suppress archers from range, employing cavalry more effectively to catch archers unprepared, waiting for weather conditions that reduced bow effectiveness, targeting English supply lines rather than seeking battle. These tactics eventually won the 100 Years' War for France, but only after decades of brutal learning through repeated defeats. The technical development of armour in response to archery threat was significant. 15th century plate armour became progressively thicker and more carefully designed, with particular attention to protecting vulnerable points. Face protection improved with heavier visors and more restricted vision slits. Gauntlets were redesigned to protect hands better. Armour for vital areas like chest and back became thick enough that bodkin points could not reliably penetrate. But this came at cost of increased weight and reduced mobility. The heaviest armour of the late 15th century made mounted combat nearly impossible and dismounted combat exhausting. This armour race ultimately proved futile, as firearms penetrated even the heaviest plate armour. By the mid-16th century, armourers realised that making armour thick enough to stop bullets made it too heavy to wear. Armour gradually became lighter, or was abandoned entirely except for ceremonial purposes. The era of armoured knights, already declining under pressure from longbows, ended completely, under pressure from firearms. The tactical evolution from Agincourt's defensive archery to more mobile combined arms warfare took decades. English commanders gradually learned to use archers more aggressively, advancing under cover of archery, using mounted archers for raiding and skirmishing, combining archers with dismounted men-at-arms in flexible formations. These developments made English armies more versatile but also more vulnerable to disruption. The tight defensive formations that had worked at Agincourt were harder to maintain with more mobile tactics. The ultimate irony of Agincourt was that its very success may have delayed English military development. The crushing victory validated traditional tactics so thoroughly that English commanders were reluctant to abandon them even when circumstances changed. While continental armies experimented with firearms, pike formations and new artillery, England clung to longbow tactics that had brought such glory. This conservatism would eventually cost England its military dominance, as more flexible continental armies proved superior in 16th century warfare. But on October 25, 1415, all of this lay in the future. On that muddy field near Azincourt, English longbowmen wrote the pinnacle achievement of their weapon system, demonstrating its maximum effectiveness under ideal conditions. They proved that massed archery combined with favourable terrain and tactical discipline could defeat seemingly overwhelming odds. They killed thousands of French nobles, shattered French military power, secured English strategic position, and created a legend that would echo through centuries. The French knights who charged laughing that morning learned the terrible lesson that technology and tactics could trump tradition and breeding, that peasant weapons wielded by trained soldiers could kill armoured nobility, that warfare was changing in ways that made individual prowess less important than collective firepower. They learned these lessons through death, drowning in mud under arrow storms, suffocating in armour, bleeding out from bodkin points, dying in ways that made their nobility and training meaningless. The field at Agincourt turned red that day, red with blood of thousands of men, noble and common mixed indiscriminately in mud that cared nothing for rank. The longbow had spoken with overwhelming voice, proving its supremacy one last glorious time before firearms would make it obsolete. English archers would never again achieve such decisive victory, never again slaughter an enemy so thoroughly while suffering so little. Agincourt was both triumph and end point, the moment when medieval warfare reached its decisive conclusion and began its transition toward modernity. The laughter had indeed turned to screaming, the confidence to terror, the charge to rout. The field had turned red, and the longbow had written its masterpiece in blood across muddy French earth. The thunder of thousands of bowstrings releasing, the whistle of arrows in flight, the screams of dying men and horses, these sounds haunted survivors forever. For English archers it was the sound of victory. For French knights it was the sound of nightmare, the sound of their world ending, the sound that proved their invincibility was illusion, and their supremacy was finished. October the 25th, 1415 was the day French chivalry died in mud and arrows, and the English longbow achieved immortality.